Hey, College Math, welcome back. Here is the first section of chapter 7. We're looking at voting for this chapter. And for this first section, we're going to focus on one of the methods for counting and determining the winner from an election, and that's the plurality method, okay? So our objectives are to define preference ballots and preference schedules, and then define and use the plurality method of counting votes. So when you think about an election, kind of hopefully you've already been exposed to that in your life. You know what an election is. We have the presidential election, and then we even have smaller elections, kind of at the local level, at the state level, etc. So when you think about an election, the typical rule for winning one is the majority rule, right? Whenever a candidate receives more than 50% of the votes, that's kind of who ends up being the winner. Now that criteria becomes harder to use in an election, especially when we have more than 3 candidates. Kind of one example is if one candidate gets 35% of the votes among those 3, then that kind of means that 65% of the population that voted in that election would rather not have that candidate be the winner. And in most cases, even though that's not more than the majority, since the majority is harder to get with 3 candidates or more, that's who the winner would be. So you have a winner where 35% of people like them, but 65% dislike them. And that's kind of not, there's got to be better ways to determine a winner aside from that, especially when you have such a big portion of the population that would prefer a different candidate, right? So kind of one way to mitigate this, to help this a little bit, is using a preference ballot. Okay, and so that's kind of the first thing we're looking at. So a preference ballot is where voters would order all the candidates from most to least favorite. So instead of just saying out of these 4 candidates, I would prefer this one, you're going to organize all 4 of your candidates into I prefer this one, then I would prefer that one, then least worst case scenario of this last person, right? And so that's what a preference ballot is, ordering all your candidates from first, second, third, onward. And then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and take these ballots and organize them into what's called a preference schedule. And that's what we're going to do here in this first example, right? So just kind of a quick example. So a class election was held to see which movies should be played at the end of the year. So students filled out a ballot ranking the movies Cars, Monsters, Inc., and Toy Story. Here are the results from the 18 students' ballots, right? So these are the different ballots that were put in. There was, the first ballot, the second ballot, third ballot, etc. And this is how each person on that ballot voted. So each ballot is one person casting a vote. Okay, so for example, this first person right here said they would prefer Cars as their first choice, Toy Story as their second, and Monsters, Inc. as their third. The second person right here said I would rather have Monsters, Inc. as my first choice, Toy Story as my second, Cars as my third, etc. Okay, so that's kind of what we have here in kind of our initial record of ballots. So now what we want to do is organize that into a preference schedule, okay? And so here's what a preference schedule looks like. So it's another table, and I'm going to have the number of ballots, because in this first row, I'm going to have the number of people that chose that specific order. So I'm going to organize this table based on the order that these choices were preferred, right? So I'm going to have a row for first choice, second choice, and third choice based on how many choices you have, right? So this will have more rows based on how many different choices were included on the ballot, okay? So then we got to kind of comb through here and see how many different ways did we vote? What were the different kind of configurations that we got, right? So let's see here. We have one configuration was that Cars was chosen first, then Toy Story, then Monsters, Inc. So that's going to be one option. So Cars, Toy Story, and Monsters, Inc. And then what I want to do is I want to look for all of the different ballots that have that order, okay? So pretty much I'm looking for all the different CTMs, okay? So let's see if I have any more. Look through, we'll see that that actually is the only time that this configuration happens. So there was only one person that voted for that order. Okay, so that's our first column. Now let's look for a different configuration. We have this one right here, Monsters, Inc., Toy Story, then Cars. So that's my next new configuration. And now I want to see how many people did that. So that was 1. Looking for another MTC. It looks like that was also 1. That was just 1 person that voted that way, okay? So now I look at CMT, and as you're looking for different configurations, check to see if you've already written that one down, right? For example, this next one, Cars, Monsters, Inc., and Toy Story. Haven't written that one down, so that's a new one. So CMT. Now I look for how many times that happens. So CMT, CMT. Here's another one. So that's 1, 2. Sorry, I mixed it up. It's 1, 2, and then 3, 4. So there's 4 different people that voted that order right there. Cars as their first choice, Monsters Inc. as their second, and Toy Story as their third. Okay, let's see if we can find any more unique ones. We have Monsters Inc., Cars, then Toy Story. That's a new one. Okay, let's count how many times. Oh, that was kind of a crooked line. There we go, a little better. Let's count how many times that one happens. So 1, 2, 3. Looks like just 3 times. Okay. Now let's look for another one. Someone that was here. This one, Toy Story, Monsters Inc., Cars. That one hasn't happened yet either. So here is another one. Monsters Inc., Cars. So let's count. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. And one easy way to kind of check to see if you need to go any further is, this total up here, the total amount of ballots here should match up how many ballots you have, right? So this is 1, 2, 6, 9, 18. And we have 18. So it looks like we're done. We're done with our preference schedule. This is our preference schedule, okay? Here in the body of the table, you have the different orders that people ordered their candidates. And then the first row is counting how many times those orders happened, okay? And that's all you have to do to make a preference schedule, okay? The number of rows is the number of candidates. So maybe it'll be helpful to write that down. Number of rows equals number, I can just use the hashtag, of candidates. Okay, and then this, so the total should equal how many ballots there are, okay? It's the number of ballots. And that's, hopefully you kind of see how obvious that is since the name of the row is number of ballots, right? So that's just a kind of a quick check, right, to make sure you did it correctly. So then based on this preference schedule, how do we determine the winner, okay? So that's going to be where that plurality method thing from the beginning of our video comes from. What is the plurality method? Well, that is a way to determine the winner. And it says that the candidate with the most first choice votes is the winner. Okay, so in a way, this is kind of like majority, but this kind of also encompasses those situations where sometimes you don't get more than half the votes. So in that case, whoever gets the most votes is the winner, right? This is kind of like that. And so here, we would kind of see, so let's just kind of write down the number of first place votes for each one. So Monsters Inc. was one of the options, Toy Story, and Cars. Okay, so for Monsters Inc., how many times did that one get first place? We have these 2 slots where it got first place. And in those 2 that we have a combined total of 4 different times. There were 4 different ballots, 4 different people that marked Monsters Inc. as their first choice. Okay, now let's look at Toy Story. So Toy Story, there was only 1 column where that happened as the first choice, but that happened with 9 ballots. Okay, so even though it's only 1 column, it got a lot of votes in that 1 column. That configuration got a lot of votes. And then Cars, we have 2 places, 1 and 4. That gives us a total of 5 ballots for Cars being first place. So then our winner for this election, for this little vote, is Toy Story. Okay, hardest part of pretty much any of the voting methods we're going to look like is making the preference schedule. Sometimes I'll give you the preference schedule, but for a lot of the, our first starting examples, I'm going to have you make it just so you get practice with where it comes from and how to use it, right? So from this method, Toy Story would be the winner. But kind of something to think about as we close out this first section. So think about this little fact. So 9 students chose, I don't know how to spell chose Toy Story as their first choice. Okay. And so that's nice, but then we kind of also want to think about the fact that 7 students voted it as their third choice. Okay. And so that kind of gets back into the first thing we looked at, right? When you have one candidate got 35% of the votes, but then that means that 65% don't really want that, right? You have like it kind of gets a little bit messier with 3 choices because yeah, it's one thing to be voted second, but it's another thing to be voted third. There were 7 people that would rather watch 2 other movies before they would watch the one that was chosen as the winner, right? And 7 is a pretty decent chunk of people, right? So how do we kind of navigate that? Well, we're gonna kind of hope we hope we can see how to navigate that with the next voting method that we'll look at in the next video, okay? But for now, this is plurality, making the preference schedule, and then we choose the winner based on how many first place votes they got, okay? I hope that sounds good. I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good rest of your day.